dudes and dudettes, it's me, E.H. Ivins, and this is another episode of The Radical Reset, the only place in America where rationality reigns. Okay, now, today we're going to talk about police, and we're going to talk about policing. In the last episode, we talked about prisons, which may be putting the cart before the horse, but today we're going to talk about policing. It's a very relevant subject, okay? I'm ignoring all the COVID shit, by the way, guys. That's going to solve itself. I'm simply not going to get into the COVID discussion while the rest of them are tearing each other's hearts out in Washington, D.C. over how much money that doesn't exist that they're going to print up out of thin air that they're going to throw at COVID. I have nothing to say other than they're all fucked in the head. I mean, whether it's 1.9 trillion or 6 or 800 billion or whatever fucking numbers they're throwing around, it's all ridiculous. It's just so stupid. No one's thinking anything through. This COVID recovery discussion has nothing to do with COVID. So we're not going to get into it, okay? That's as much as I'm going to say about it, at least today. I'm going to talk about policing because it's a permanent subject versus this COVID, which is let me just say, a year or two from now, we're just not going to even remember it anymore. I mean, we'll remember it in the sense that we remember 9/11, but we're not going to be obsessed by it day to day. But policing is something that invades our lives. And I use the word invade intentionally every day. So let's have a really frank discussion. And I want to begin this by saying I'm not anti-police. I've never been anti-police. Anybody who's known me almost from birth until now will tell you that I'm the furthest thing from anti-police, but my opinions have changed as my knowledge has expanded. You know, for years and years and years, I've been an enormous fan of the Dick Wolf Law and Order franchise. Now, whether you watched it as Law and Order, or whether you watched it as Law and Order SVU, or Law and Order New York, or Law and Order Los Angeles, or Law and Order Criminal Intent, or Law and Order, I mean, he's got a million, I don't even know all the and he has foreign variations because I see him on, and I've watched the British version on Netflix, and they all follow the same basic version. Half the show is the investigation, half the show is the prosecution. And it's wonderful because at the end of the show, the bad guy always gets it. You always know who the bad guy is, and you always know that they're going to get it in the end. Now, once every 50 episodes or so, they throw in a show where the bad guy gets away with it. I think that's Dick Wolf's way of being, what's the word I'm looking for? Somewhat genuine, somewhat realistic, but he's not even close. Because here's the truth of it. Police don't solve a fucking thing, okay? Very, very little. The national solve rates of both homicide and robbery, and you can check my statistics on this, are in the single digits and almost nothing. Now, let me explain what I mean by solve rate. I want to be very clear so that any of you who are watching who are police are going to not be able to dispute what I'm saying, which is to say, there is a difference between intervention and investigation. Now, the police intervene all the time and catch all kinds of shit. We'll get into that in just 1 second. But as far as solving the crime, like you see on Law and Order, they come to your home, you've been either robbed or someone has been murdered in your family or friends or whatever it might be. No one knows what's going on. It's not obvious. The perpetrator was not caught in the act. There was nothing to find, okay? They just don't solve those crimes. I mean, they do on TV, but in no other way. They suck. They don't solve a fucking thing. I mean, any of you who have ever been robbed know when the police come to your house to take the inventory, it's for the insurance company. They're not going to try to solve that fucker. It's gone. The only way they're going to catch the guys that robbed your house is sheer dumb luck. If they trip into it during a drug bust and find your shit in the living room of the drug addict that broke in to steal it. That is the only fucking way, and that's intervention, not investigation, okay? Investigation, where they go out and they get leads and the forensics guy come in like on CSI and they find the little minute shit and they get through it all and they tie it around and they follow motive and they track down the bad guy is all a fucking fantasy, okay? The police, again, check my statistics. The police solve almost no investigative case of robbery or homicide. So if you've got someone out there that you want to kill, it is exceptionally easy to get away with murder in the United States if you're not caught in the act, okay? Or robbery. I mean, again, when I was in prison, I met a lot of guys who were caught for robbery and in prison. They were fucking idiot addicts who had the shit in their living room. None of them were discovered through investigation. The police get nothing, which is interesting because we see the manifestation of it in this simple fact. There are far more private police in the United States than public. Think about that. Just I know you never have, because I didn't think about it until I really looked at it, but think about it. Everywhere you look, everybody that has anything worth protecting hires private security if they can afford it. Okay, there are private security in malls, there are private security in banks, there are private security in industrial sites, there's private security in hospitals, there are private security in schools. Everywhere where security is important, they hire private security. Is that because private security is worse than the police, or is that because it is far more responsive, far less expensive in the terms of taxes versus what you pay, and far more efficient and protects the property better? So in an anti-political state, police would be private. Now, I know you're saying to yourself, I just can't see security guards as police. But imagine companies that specialize in policing that compete for the contract of the local municipality, who, by the way, can revoke the contract. In an anti-political state, there's going to be no police unions. We'll get to that in a minute, too. So the fact is, today, before we get into an anarchic state, the fact is there are far more private police than public. And a lot of public police, the good ones, leave public policing and go to work for the private ones. And not just here in the United States, but all over the world. What do you think private contractors are that go overseas, that are former special forces and former police and former MPs and everything else? They're private police. Don't fall into the security guard thing. They're private police. The difference between a security guard and a policeman is a union and a gun. Okay? I know the police look down their nose at private security. That's the arrogance of bureaucracy. In fact, there is far more private police because they do their job better. Remember, the police solve nothing. The police investigate terribly. It is private police. In fact, most of the times they don't bother to investigate. If they don't catch the guy in the act, they just move on. They're bureaucrats like any other. Okay, now, here's what I talk about, and this is why I'm opposed to public policing, especially the way it's going on in America today. And this is a real statistic. In 1980, there were 3,000 SWAT raids. Now, for those of you who have been living in a vacuum, SWAT is an acronym that stands for Special Weapons and Tactics. It is a quasi-military part of virtually every police force in the country outside of Mayberry RFD. And they, in 1980, did 3,000 SWAT raids. In 2020, there were 50,000 SWAT raids. Now, has the population become that much more lawless that we can somehow justify 3,000 to 50,000? Or have the police either advertently or inadvertently discovered, consciously or unconsciously, that they suck at investigation, so all they can do is intervene, and therefore they intervene with SWAT, which is overwhelming force because, frankly, they have balls the size of basketballs. There's a lot of testosterone, even among the women in SWAT, and they love to raid. 50,000 versus 3,000. Think about that. 3/4 of those 50,000 raids, 3/4, okay, were small drug busts. Small drug busts. 50,000 times they broke into people's homes. 50,000 times they invaded people's privacy. 50,000 times they entered with guns and flak jackets. And out of those 50,000 times, 75% of them were some pathetic addict, and it was a small drug bust. That's fucking sick. But why do they do it? And the answer is asset forfeiture. Police departments get to keep what they seize. And so they regularly invade, and this is, of course, there's more reasons, but they're all negative, but this is a primary driving reason. Along the way, our government took the fascistic step of allowing police to preemptively seize assets they suspect of drug dealers or any other illegal activity or plot. And afterwards, even if the person is exonerated, they often keep the asset. Okay? Asset forfeiture. That would never happen in an anti-political society. Remember, guys, now I know that this is going to strike a deep chord. You know, I'm advocating private police versus public police. I'm saying the public police suck. And I'll say it again. Public police suck because they are nothing but bureaucrats with guns. Okay, remember this. And I wrote this down because I want you to write this down. This is the most important thing for you to remember. The strength of any bureaucracy, okay, police, Army, it doesn't matter. The strength of any bureaucracy is measured by its ability to resist providing anyone decent treatment. The strength of any bureaucracy is measured in its ability to resist providing decent treatment to anyone. And I want you to reflect on the last time you had dealings with a publicly hired policeman, whether it was a traffic stop, whether it was investigating a robbery in your home, whether you were suspected of something, and tell me that you got a good result. And tell me if you're decent. Put it below in the comments of this podcast. Now, I'm sure somewhere out there, and I've had the experience too, you've met a polite policeman. I'm not saying that even in the Gestapo, I'm sure there were nice Gestapo agents, believe it or not. I know how life is not black and white, it's gray. And I'm sure among the Gestapo, the vast majority of them were just former policemen before that regime took over. So they went from private policemen to Gestapo agents, which is exactly what would happen in America if America continues, not becomes, continues on its path towards totalitarianism, because that's where we're headed. We're doing everything right. By the way, as a side note, there's a new book out, relatively new book out that I want you to check out. You can pick it up in paperback. It's not available electronically. It's written by Naomi Wolf, and Naomi Wolf wrote a little, it's very short, it's called The End of America, and it goes through the 10 things that always happens in the decline of a democracy that the totalitarians always do, and makes the case that they're all happening now. And she does it better than I can do it in this short podcast. So pick up your copy of Naomi Wolf's The End of America. It's an excellent, excellent book. Okay, I was digressing. That really wasn't on my radar, but I added it in spontaneously. As you can tell, I'm looking down. I'm sticking to the script, guys. I'm sticking to my track. I'm not going off into la la land. But anyway. So why is intervention so popular? Well, because it's easier than investigation. I mean, investigating takes brains. And let's face it, the best and the brightest aren't going to work at the police department. Let's really be honest. What are the police but a bunch? Now, before I say this, I want to resist strident, broad generalization. So I'm going to disclaim what I'm about to say before I say what I think is obvious. There are, just like I said, there were nice Gestapo agents and there are nice policemen. There are competent policemen, few and far between, mixed into the mix. But the vast majority of policemen, like the vast majority of any other bureaucracy, are mediocrities who either wanted a job where it was almost impossible to fire them, or, and they'll never admit this, get off on being police and riding roughshod over people who make more, have more brains and more talent, and enjoy being in a position to hassle those who they envy and hate. Okay, and I'm not talking about racism. I'm not talking about picking on black people. That's another subject for many other podcasts, and we'll get into that in just a minute. And yes, there is a bias because, frankly, more black people commit crimes than white people, but that was caused by the government, not by black people. This is just a travesty of government-caused disaster trying to cover up government-caused disaster. You know, first the government destroys the nuclear family, and in particular the black nuclear family, through AFDC, Aid the Family with Dependent Children, / what we call welfare. They destroy it. In 1959, there were almost no single black families or white families or any other color for that matter. Today, it's nearly 70%. And what's the result then? A fucking disaster. So what do? Police up. And what did the police do? Intervene, because they can't investigate a fucking thing because they're too goddamn average. See, you thought I was going to say stupid. They're not stupid. They're average. And average people, mediocrity seeks a low water point so it can hide under the radar. Most people don't want to stick their heads up. Most people are like prairie dogs. They're comfortable in the hole and they'll kind of peek up out and look around and then they'll duck right back in the hole. That's who becomes policemen, who enjoy riding roughshod over other people. How do I know that? Because that's most people anyway. It's the worst among us. Would you select to be a policeman? I mean, really. Now, here comes another thought to put into your mind as we discuss private policing versus public policing and doing away. And I'm going to get into a little bit, I'll get into it today. I'll get a little bit into justice in just a minute. Okay, so all the police are a public display of a protection racket, if you think about it. Okay, now for years and years and years, the primary business of the mob, and by the way, if you want a little popular culture reinforcement of what I'm about to say, watch the movie that I consider the best movie ever made of all time, Goodfellas. In Goodfellas, Henry Hill, the character Henry Hill, played by Ray Liotta, straight out says, that's it. That's all the Mafia is, a giant private police force, basically. I'm paraphrasing the line in the movie. That's all the Mafia ever was. Yeah, the Mafia was involved in drugs, and yes, the Mafia was involved, but those are all, The mafia would go traditionally into anything that where people did it, they still do. When I say mafia, by the way, I'm not talking just Italians. I don't care what, in fact, let me use the mob, and we'll talk about Italians and Latinos and black. The mob in general is a giant protection racket in the areas that they police and or the gang controls and or, the cartel runs. And if you've been in Mexico, by the way, this is not just an American phenomenon. Again, I'm going to give you a wonderful movie to watch. And this is completely on subject. This movie's been out for a long time. It stars, I think, Gael Garcia, and it's called El Crimen del Padre Amaro. Now, it's the crime of Father Amaro. It's a story about a young priest who's sent to a small village in Mexico run by a local drug lord and what happens to him. It's all in Spanish, but it's subtitled. It's a wonderful movie. You don't have to speak. In fact, I think it's Academy Award worthy. It's a terrific movie. El Crimen del Padre Amaro. Watch the movie, and it'll show the way drug lords. It's a great story besides, and I'm not going to tell you what the crime is, but there is a crime. But it's a great story in that it shows you how the Mexican drug lord is really a hero to his community. It's he who funds the local hospital. It's he who funds the local clinic. It's he who takes care of the local poor people. It's he who protects them from violence. And that's what it is. The mob is a giant protection racket, a giant private police force. The average person doesn't care what it does to raise money besides it. The average person, I don't care, you don't care about whether they're selling heroin to some fucking loser on a street corner who's going to kill himself anyway. Let's be honest, okay? To the average person who's not taking drugs and not committing crimes, the local drug lord slash mafioso slash gang leader can be your first line of protection because they're effective. Unlike the police, okay, who don't understand the communities in most cases that they're policing. You take a kid out of the suburbs, you throw him into a uniform, and you throw him into a black area of lower economic status, and this kid has no basis. He has no way to understand the communities policing. Where the local drug lord understands it perfectly, and they're much more effective. But again, the police suck. Why do the police suck? Because the power of a bureaucracy is measured in its ability to resist providing decent treatment to anyone. Where the mafia, a completely voluntary organization, yes, but they don't commit violence on average people. They kill each other because they can't go to court to adjudicate a dispute in, let's say, a drug transaction. But they don't kill ma and pa in the street. They protect them in return for a fee. Tell me how that's any different from taxation. Tell me how giving up 40 or 50% of my income for the protection of the state is worse than a small fee I might pay my local drug lord to do it effectively. Explain to me how that could be bad. And it's not. Okay, I realize that, I'm running, when I have this discussion, and one of the reasons that I'm in favor of secession is because we're not going to reconcile with those of us who are of a different opinion because of the way we're wired. In other words, what's his name? Jonathan Haidt. If you want to see some interesting stuff on YouTube, check out Jonathan Haidt. He does a lot of very interesting things. One of the things that he talks about, and I agree with 100%, is that of how people are wired. And those of us who are freedom-oriented, libertarian-oriented, /anarcho-capitalist-oriented, /antipolitist, like I am, tend to be about 70% intellect and 30% empathy. It's not that we don't have empathy, but our empathy is overwhelmed by our intellect. Not that we're geniuses. When I say overwhelmed by our intellect, I mean how our thought processes work. 70% of the time, those of you out there agreeing with me are probably about 70-30 intellect to empathy. Where people on the other end of the spectrum, okay, the progressives, I'm not talking about the leadership, which are venal power seekers. I'm talking about the average person on the street. They're not evil. They're 70-30 the other way. Okay, they're empathetic and 70% of the time, and that, therefore, to you and to I, they can often seem irrational. Where to themselves, they're perfectly rational. I say leave it to them. We are not, you and I, as 70-30 intellects, are not going to convince a 70-30 emotional. It's just not going to happen. We're going to divide. And I know I'm being simplistic, and I know there are gray areas, and I know there are crossovers, but if we get bogged down in those details, we're not going to, in an anti-political state, the details don't matter because it's completely free. Completely free. And that brings me to adjudication. Okay, one more point I want to make before I move on to adjudication. If everything else I haven't registers with you, doesn't register with you, or anything else I've said doesn't register with you, think about this. In the 20th century in the United States, there were total murders in the low 4 digits, 3,000 or 4,000, in the whole fucking century. Okay. How many people were killed by the military? Okay, we lost 500,000 US soldiers in the last century, and we inflicted tens of millions of casualties. Now tell me, which is more destructive and more dangerous? Okay, now, by the way, anyway, the state cannot have a monopoly on lethal force. That's really what it comes right down to. In an anti-political government, in an anarcho-capitalist government, which we are not, we are a transition to anarcho-capitalism. To me, and I'm not going to go into what that is because I'm assuming that since we have such a small viewership that those of you watching me are already schooled on this. Anarcho-capitalism, to me, is a goal like communism is for the socialists, in the sense that one day it might be achieved, but we haven't evolved enough as a species to be in a position where we can actually live in complete anarchy at this point. There are too many side effects left over from the destruction of the social welfare state, and it's going to take too many generations to iron it out, not to mention the evolution of thought and philosophy, which brings me to why, and so basically anti-politism and libertarian thought too, is just, these are all transitional ideas to come ultimately to an anarcho-capitalist state that none of us, I can say with total certainty, will live to see. Now, having said that, we are getting very close to the collapse of the United States economically, and therefore the world order, and this is an opportunity for us if we strike while the iron is hot. Therefore, I'm discussing subjects like these, like crime and policing and everything else, so you get some idea. So in the interim, between the revolution, which I hope will be peaceful, and ultimately anarcho-capitalism, I view our state to be, as much as possible, done by private hands, because if there's one, and I'm going to hit this point again and again, if there's one central fact that all of us can agree upon, left or right, it's that everything the government touches, it turns to shit. Everything the government touches, it turns to shit. Now, people on the left believe, they won't disagree. We all agree on that. Okay, people on the left will say, yeah, everything the government touches has turned to shit. The people on the right will say everything the government touches turns to shit. The people in the middle will say everything the government touches turns to shit. But the difference between those of us out here on what is perceived, and it's only a perception, to be extreme, we will seem reasonable when the shit hits the fan. But those of us out here in what is perceived as the extreme now, let's put us aside. For everybody else, they have a belief, and to the degree that they have this belief is an indication of where they are on the political spectrum, that the only reason that's always failed before is that they weren't the ones doing it. If somehow they could get in charge, they could fix and do things right differently than all the fucked up things in the past. And I think that's absurd. And that's why I'm not out there, and that's why you're not out there, but that's what these people believe. And we're not going to convince them. So I say, we basically grab what we can and get the fuck out of here. In my dream world, and this is a dream world, I personally would grab the state of, when I say grab, I'd run for election in the state of Colorado. As the governor, I'd elect an anti-political legislature, start a political movement, and secede. Now, when I say secede, I would just go for nullification. I would, and I know now I'm brain surfing, but I would simply ignore the federal government. I'd put my militia on Colorado's borders to federal police and enforcement officials, and I would take over the National Guard and disband it. And I would set up an anti-political society, and in that anti-political society, we could remain a part of the United States as a transition. I would tell all the residents of Colorado to stop paying income tax. And we would replace it with something other than income tax, fees, user fees, sales taxes, very small for a minimal government, run up the way I'm talking about, and we would live happily ever after. Okay, I'm not going into national, I could have really gone into national defense there, but I'm not going to. Okay, let's talk about adjudicating. Right now, don't confuse law, okay, with reason. Law is just a bunch of rules put down by the ruling elite that we have to follow because the state has a monopoly on violence. Reason is what we really should be talking about, and reason and when it comes to what is legal and what is illegal, ought to be based on natural law. Natural law is a very simple concept, okay? And you can look, again, this is a short podcast, and I don't have all day to go into a discussion on natural law because it's going to turn into one of those hour-long lecture podcasts, and who the fuck watches that? So very briefly, natural law says you own your body, you own your property, and no one has any right to fuck with it. Okay, when you fuck with someone else's body and someone else's property, then you have done something wrong, and that should be solved somehow. Now, the question is, what's wrong with our legal system, and how would I change that? Well, I would change it. In an anti-political society, a judge would, oops, I just knocked the light. I don't know if you can tell that. Anyway, a judge would not be a lawyer. It would be actually a career path called judge. And people would be educated in two areas to achieve the designation, the degree judge, okay? And that would be equal studies of natural law and philosophy, okay? Particularly Stoic philosophy. Stoicism, and this is a broader subject, is the underpinnings of everything I'm talking about and what I think ought to be the underpinnings of an anti-political society. Basically, if you're not familiar with Stoicism, in a sentence, it is the philosophical school that says all things in life worth anything come from character and values, okay? And suffering is absorbed as part of life, and you attack life coming from a solid value substructure, okay? Now, there's lots more to it than that, but we would educate our judge class, okay? The group of people who would become judges would be educated both in natural law and philosophy, so that they have a much broader, that would be the degree path. When they graduated from college with their degree and to become a judge, these would be the two levels and they would be educated in. Now they would then go into a career pool, a judge pool. And when a case came up, when somebody was accused by somebody else of, let's say, it could be anything, murder, robbery, whatever it might be, anything that infringes on somebody else's violence, then a 3-judge panel will first be selected. There are two levels. One is the warrant court and one is the conviction court, or the potential conviction court. We'll come up with a better name than that. That's not a good name, but I haven't really thought about it. When the police want to go out, the private police want to go out and arrest somebody for committing a crime, they will present the evidence that they have accumulated through investigation to a 3-judge warrant court, who will then look at it all and determine if a violation of natural law has taken place. If the violation of natural law has taken place, then the police will proceed to arrest the accused, still accused only, with innocence being the presumption. They will arrest them and bring them to trial. At the trial, okay, the accused really doesn't need a lawyer unless they want one. If they want one, I'm not going to make lawyers illegal. It just won't be necessary, because the 3-judge panel is not going to be worried about the obscure precedent from God knows when, back at the time Roger Taney was serving on the Supreme Court. Those of you who don't know who that is, I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to tell you to do your homework. He was the presiding Chief Justice on a very famous decision. That's your hint. Anyway, so this 3-judge panel would listen to the accused present his or her defense, the prosecution present their case and make a ruling, and if found guilty, if the person is guilty, there is no defense, or they simply can't explain away all the evidence that's been presented through investigation by the police and by the prosecutor, then it's up to the 3-judge panel to make the sentence with no mandatory sentencing. Mandatory sentencing is very bad. And let me digress slightly. This is where I think a lot of black people feel very victimized, because since drugs run rampant in certain parts of the black inner city community in particular, and more black people are arrested because more black people are caught by crimes, because the people are intervening and the police are intervening in their lives, because of mandatory sentencing, they get very long sentences versus the white kids in the suburbs who are never investigated and intervened in, because no policeman in a suburban community in their right mind is going to just willy-nilly invade the home of an upper middle class white guy. It's just not going to happen. And poor black people have a legitimate beef. And it's not because they're black, it's because of the idiocy of mandatory sentencing. And the people who came up with this idiocy, and I'll name a name, Jeff Sessions, that motherfucker, and I'll name a second name. The current president of the United States made his career on this shit. Joe Biden is behind this crap. Mandatory sentencing punishes minorities unfairly because of the high degree of intervention arrests, particularly the 3/4 of all SWAT busts that are drug arrests. But in an anti-political world, this 3-man judge would look at everything in the big picture and where the person comes from and the background and what their family is and talk to them and come up with a sentence, and based on the system that I outlined in the last podcast, decide whether an appropriate place for them is the prison system or probation and going back home. Okay, on a case-by-case basis, on a 3-person panel of non-political, okay, non-lawyer, okay, people who are members of the same society and make a rational judgment based both on natural law and philosophy, which gives them a rounded way, and there'll never be a tie vote, 2 out of 3 rules. And so we get a much more, will it be a perfect system? No. Will we ever convict or put away people that are innocent? I'm sure. But since we're not going to ever have the death penalty or mandatory lifetime sentences for 3 strikes and bullshit like that, there will always be a chance for the wrongfully convicted to turn it around. Okay, always. Okay, no limit. They can, if they find something that exonerates them, they go before a 3-man panel, present what they've come up with, or their family, or their friends, or their lawyer, or their whatever it is. Present the new evidence, and if it's compelling, they don't have to go through. You've seen it on TV where they exonerate the guy, and the guy has to sit in prison for 3. In fact, you've seen it in real life. They have to sit in prison 2 weeks to a month more, and I'm telling you, when you're close to release, I can tell you from experience, that's a long 2 weeks or month to wait while they process them out. That's how they can't even release somebody when they fuck up. They got to make them sit in that fucking shithole for another 2 to 4 weeks or even longer while they process the paperwork. That's never going to happen in our world. Okay. I think that's it for today. I think I've covered it all. So, what do you think? Do you think that was a good idea? If you do, or at least you were intrigued by the idea, please click on the subscribe button, click on the notification button, and share this podcast with your friends. Also, pick up a copy of The Radical Reset. The Radical Reset is the manifesto of anti-politism, and it lays out the entire program, the nearly perfect government on its way to the ultimate anarcho-capitalist state that none of us will live to see, so it's really a suggestion or a prescription for now. I think you'll enjoy it. It is free for you to read in the Kindle Lending Library, or you can pick up a hard copy for a nominal fee. Take your pick. Either way, even when you read for free, every time you turn the page, you are supporting this podcast, and I thank you. That's it. Until next time, this is your Uncle Herbie and the Radical Reset saying so long.